Peace be with you. Welcome to the Institute of All Intelligent Life. My name is Allan Keislar. Today is Thursday, the 27th of October, 2016. And we are continuing our discussion about densities and wanderers, and the topic we have already introduced of ascension or the Day of Judgment. And we're going to begin talking about the recent history of our planet. Recent means not in terms of what our modern educational system teaches as history, recent history, but by recent I mean the last 75,000 years or so is what we're going to briefly go over today. But just first to review the topics we've been covering. We were talking about the densities, which we have to keep in mind as we're recalling this history, because the gradual progress of consciousness on a planet is one of the most basic features, perhaps the most basic feature, of the history of that planet. So we progress, that is, the planet progresses, and the living beings on the planet progress from the first density, which is the stage of mineral or elementals like earth, water, fire, and air, to the stage of plant and animal life, the second density, which is characterized especially by turning towards the light and by growth, and then to the human stage, the stage of self-awareness, reflectiveness, and then the fourth density, which is the critical point in human history that we are at right now, is when the third density, human beings, ascend to the fourth density, which basically is the way of life based on love, based on harmony and unity, based on telepathy, where the most prominent characteristic that I've described before is that there can be no more deception and lying, because basically everyone can know what everyone else is thinking without them saying anything. So in the third density, speech, communication by speech, is a prominent feature, and that sort of communication naturally allows for lying, because speaking means you can say something different than what you're thinking or feeling in your heart. But the fourth density means there's no more such lying and deception, because everyone becomes telepathic. So that's where we're at now. We're at that stage of ascending from the third density to the fourth density. And because of this very, very critical time, there are a couple of reasons why many wanderers have come to this planet, to our Earth at this time. And that is because, well, two reasons. One is because our planet needs a lot of help in making this transition, which we're going to study later more about the history of our planet and how and why our history is quite different than the ordinary progression. But in any case, we're facing a very difficult challenge at this point, where we're trying to make the ascension into the fourth density. So this period, which is often called the Day of Judgment, is very important, and there are two reasons why wanderers are especially now coming. One is to help in this transition, and the second is to make rapid spiritual progress themselves or ourselves. Why is that? Because in this third density there is forgetfulness. We are often confused and unaware, especially because of the deception that we have been subjected to. So in that sort of condition, much more faith is required, much more intuition must be developed in order to satisfactorily progress, and there are much greater tests. So this third density is very special because in higher densities we have much more knowledge and wisdom, so there aren't so many challenges and tests. And it is these challenges that enable us to make great spiritual advancement, although also there are risks involved, of course, in being forgetful or having our awareness obscured. There's also the possibility of rapid descent, you might say, or rapid bewilderment and confusion, and at least for some time our spiritual progress can be interrupted. So, but this is a very, very special opportunity that all of us are in right now, this time of the Day of Judgment or the Ascension. So that's just a quick review of the densities, and the wanderers are, as I went into some detail yesterday, those beings who have ascended already beyond the third density, gone on to fourth, fifth, sixth density, sometimes even those of higher density, seventh density, and even those from the next octave. That is, the eighth density of this octave is the first density of the next octave. So even higher beings sometimes come, and at this time some have come to help in this transition or this ascension. So the wanderers are a very important feature, especially of this ascension, where we need a lot of help. Our planet needs a lot of help in making this change into the fourth density, and many, many of the beings, the natives of this earth, are not really ready for ascension, and by this time should be ready. So we are discussing these topics. So I just will conclude this introduction by saying a little bit more about ascension. In one sense, every transition, the transition from first density to second density is an ascension. The transition from second density to third density is an ascension. The transition from third density to fourth density is the ascension that we're talking about right now. Similarly, ascending on to fifth and sixth dimensions, etc., is also an ascension. So there are a series of different types of ascensions that we undergo. So what I really want to talk about now is the history of the past cycle. I earlier in this course have talked about the cycles of life on our planet of about 25,000 years. A little bit more than 25,000 years. Usually it's calculated 2,160 years as an age. We're talking about the zodiacal ages, the ages of the zodiac, which is 1/12 of the whole cycle of the precession of the equinoxes, as it is called. So that entire cycle, if you multiply 2,120 by 12, is about 25,920, something like that. I don't remember the exact figure. Anyway, just as an approximation to make it easy to calculate, we talk about 25,000-year cycles. So the cycle that we're in, which is concluding now, is a 75,000-year cycle. That is a cycle of 3 of these 25,000-year cycles. And the first of these 3 cycles ended 50,000 years ago. And at each one of these 3 cycles in the larger cycle of 75,000 years, there is an opportunity for ascension. Just like the seasons of the year, we pass through spring, summer, fall, and winter, and then a new year begins in the beginning of spring, usually it's calculated. Then we go through another cycle of a year until the next spring. So similarly, these 25,000-year cycles, a longer year we might call it, a sort of solar system progress that makes, as I've explained before, it's really due to the fact that our sun has a companion star, which is a dark dwarf, so we don't see it. It's an infrared star. And these 2 stars, our sun and that star, are circling each other. And each one of those circles, each one of those orbits is this 25,000-year period. So there is a sort of longer year, just like our year is the rotation of our Earth around the sun. So similarly, this longer year is the rotation of our sun and our sun's companion star, around each other. So after 25,000 years, there is an opportunity for ascension. So because we, that is the natives of our planet, had entered into this cycle 75,000 years ago, 25,000 years ago approximately, 50,000 years ago, 25,000 years after the start of this cycle, was an opportunity for ascension. But sadly we can say, or unusually maybe, there were no beings who were ready for the ascension. And the second opportunity was then 25,000 years ago, when there was another opportunity for ascension, and a number of beings, a small number, were ready, but they made the decision, just like wanderers have made the decision to come into third density to help the planet, especially at this critical time of ascension, of transition into the fourth density. Those third density beings who were ready for ascension into fourth density 25,000 years ago made the decision to stay in third density to help the inhabitants of the earth progress, so that by this time, by the present opportunity for ascension, more would be ready. So just a very, very brief history of this 75,000 year cycle is what I want to talk about today. Again, this information is coming from the Law of One books, and the two most basic features that might be important for us in the long term of this cycle are that there were two civilizations that developed, which our modern historians, the Western historians of the present age, don't talk about. They even sort of mock people who talk about them, because these civilizations were before our current scholars, archaeological and anthropological studies have penetrated, and so they deny the existence of these two civilizations. But the later one was Atlantis, which probably many of you have heard of, and there is a lot of evidence of the existence of a civilization, an advanced civilization, in the area of what is now the Atlantic Ocean, and there are a few remnants of it. There are pyramids that were built which are underwater today in the Atlantic off the coast of North America, for example. So we do know there is evidence, but it's been suppressed by the cabal, by the so-called Illuminati, who basically control our educational systems. They have concealed the information largely about Atlantis. But it was a great civilization, and before Atlantis there was a civilization in the area of the Pacific Ocean, which was called Lemuria, or Mu. And these two civilizations were very important in human development. The existence of humanity in a less civilized state has been going on this entire 75,000 year cycle. But these two civilizations were the early developments of higher civilization. That's why they're important. So the Lemurian civilization began about 53,000 years ago. That is, towards the end of the first of these three cycles within this 75,000 year cycle. So just about 3,000 years ago, these are very, very approximate figures, of course, about 3,000 years before the end of the first cycle, a civilization arose in the continent of Lemuria, which at that time existed above the water in the Pacific. And there are also remnants of this civilization underwater off the coast of Japan and in other places. So the Lemurian civilization was it was an agricultural civilization. They did not have vast technological developments as we consider the important, as we meaning our modern civilization considers the important part of civilization, usually, big skyscraper buildings and technology. So Lemuria was not advanced in that way, but it was spiritually advanced. So they were a group of people who, we would say they were nice people, basically. And they had an uneventful history until the end of that cycle, which was accompanied by shifts in the Earth's tectonic plates. So the entire civilization of Lemuria sank underneath the Pacific Ocean. Some of the members of that civilization who were more conscious, they understood this was coming, so they left their continent and they went to South America, North America, and Russia. At that time there was still the land bridge between Alaska and Russia. And the rest of the civilization disappeared, but their descendants in these places, in the Americas and in Siberia or Russia, they continued. The next important civilization that developed was the Atlantean civilization, which, as I mentioned, was in the area mainly of what's now the Atlantic Ocean. The history of Atlantis is a little more complex than the Lemurian history. I think it was about 31,000 years ago, as I recall, when this civilization began, and it gradually developed over a long period of time, and about 15,000 years ago, that is after it had been developing for 16,000 years, an infusion of knowledge was made, and I'll talk about that more later. But as a result of that, they started progressing more gradually and then more quickly technologically, as well as in other ways. But the most significant development for Atlantean history was the technological advancement that started at that time. And for a period of several thousand years, that developed gradually and then more quickly, and finally it led to a very negative consequence, which we know today, with the development, for example, of nuclear power, that technological advancement, which could have been used for peaceful purposes, which would have led to a lot of advancement of our civilization. It also led to the development of atomic bombs and the threat of destroying our civilization even. Well, that is what happened in Atlantis, that the development of advanced technologies, not only nuclear weapons, but even more advanced weapons, were developed using technologies based on the use of crystals, which are a powerful medium for healing and for other improvements also. But as a result of this, about 11,000 years ago, there were not just one, but several wars between different belligerent groups, and that resulted finally in the destruction of the Atlantean civilization. As I recall, the final war was just a few hundred years after the first one, and at that time, 10,800, 900 years ago, the Atlantean civilization was virtually destroyed. Again, some of the more conscious members of that society knew what was coming, they understood in advance, and they left, and they settled in three areas particularly: the mountainous areas of South America, which we now call the Andes, the mountainous areas of Turkey, and the mountainous areas of the Himalayas. So the descendants of the Atlantean civilization were settled in these three areas, whereas the descendants of the Lemurian civilization had settled in South America, North America, and Russia. So that's a very, very brief synopsis of the first two major civilizations on our planet. And of course, after that, we developed the civilizations that we're more familiar with from our own historical and anthropological study. There was a great civilization developing in China, in Sumeria, Babylon, and of course the rest is history for us, with the Greeks and Egyptians and South Asian civilization and South American civilizations. So we are going to move now into the study of our history, beginning with the little more detailed history of this present cycle of 75,000 years, which is just concluding now, and then we will go back and talk about the earlier history also to that. So let us see the time. Maybe we'll take a break here to see if there are any questions or comments, and if there are, we can discuss if anybody has questions about what I've talked about so far. I don't see any real questions, so we can talk a little bit more about the densities and the history of our planet. And I guess the most significant events that we will discuss now were the Egyptian and South American civilizations, which were characterized by, and they're still, of course, available to us to view, although, again, our so-called educational system has suppressed this knowledge, but there were very advanced civilizations, very powerful, technologically advanced also civilizations, and monuments are there, large stone monuments are there, which prove that there were great advanced civilizations, both in Egypt and in other parts of the world, especially in South America, where there are also incredible, and in Turkey also, there are monuments which show that there were people living there who had incredible technological abilities. Especially one clear example, of course, is the pyramid, the Great Pyramid and other pyramids in Egypt, which were built by a technology that we can hardly reproduce now. Similarly, in Baalbek, which is actually in Syria, and in the Turkey area, there are stone monuments built with huge stones, each stone weighing many, many tons, sometimes 100 tons and more. And similarly, in South America, there are these large stone buildings, structures, made of huge stones again, which have been fitted together perfectly. It's inconceivable to even modern technological ability how these could have been built. So there were highly advanced civilizations throughout our planet. We're talking now about in that time after the Atlantean civilization, when their descendants and others also developed these technologically advanced civilizations. And the characteristic that we especially can view today, which proves their existence, is these huge stone monuments. So I could go into a little more detail if you're interested in that. Otherwise, I will talk a little bit now about the Sumerian and Babylonian civilization, which is also an extraterrestrially contacted civilization. The Sumerian civilization is quite amazing. It apparently came out of nothing and developed very, very quickly. That is, as far as our modern archaeologists and anthropologists have been able to determine, the civilization in Sumeria, that is in Iraq, what is now known as Iraq, southern Iraq is where it started. It developed very, very quickly and developed many aspects, agriculture, of course, and then cities were built, temples were built, and even spaceports. Recently, an airport was opened in southern Iraq, and I don't recall all the details, but one of the ministers of the Iraqi government made the statement that here there was the first airport in the world, 7,000 years ago, I think he mentioned. And he said it was an extraterrestrial airport or spaceport. So there are a number of spaceports dating from that time of the Sumerian civilization in not only Iraq, but in Sinai there is also a spaceport, and in Syria. And throughout the whole Babylonian area, the area of what we call the Middle East, there was this advanced civilization which continued for many years and developed different branches, including Egypt and Babylon. And that whole area was a most important, usually considered the cradle of civilization in our modern so-called historical studies, but it was a very, very important development. And at the same time, there were, of course, important developments in China and India, or Pakistan. The Indus civilization in Pakistan, and of course it went over the border of present-day border into India and even into Afghanistan. And the borders of the Babylonian civilization extended also up into Europe and westward into Egypt and North Africa. So the world at that time was basically characterized by these civilizations as well as the civilization in South America. So the developments in those civilizations is going to be the topic of our talk tomorrow, our class tomorrow, Friday. And then the next day on Saturday we will have an Urdu chat. So I'm looking forward to discussing more about this. We have a question here from Nusrat Jabin. What is your source of this information of civilizations of past ages? I am just being curious. Very good question. Thank you very much. The source of the information about Lemuria and Atlantis that I'm giving those dates, that comes from the Law of One, Lawofone, the Law of One books. There are 4 books which I've mentioned before, which are available online, so you can read those books. I highly recommend them. And also the information about the Sumerian civilization, the Egyptian, and the later civilizations, Chinese, South American. This is available directly in the modern textbooks also, although they conceal a lot of it, but we all know from our university studies or high school studies of the existence of these civilizations. So more details about those civilizations are available from the Sumerian texts especially. These were the texts that were written on tablets, mud tablets, in the Sumerian language, which is a cuneiform language that was impressed upon the clay tablets with a stylus or like a pen, and they just pushed into the clay, and those have survived. They're the earliest surviving documents we have. So therefore the Sumerian language and civilization is usually considered the oldest civilization, the cradle of civilization. It wasn't, but it was considered that way because our modern educational system and scientific system has not acknowledged the existence of Atlantean and Lemurian civilizations yet. And they will. They're being forced to gradually, and it will come out soon. But so those are the basic sources. The actual documents available from the Sumerian texts, which talk about the civilization. It talks about their spaceports. It talks about the fact that people came from other planets to this planet at that time, about 5, 6, 7,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. Sometime in that period, there was the flowering of the civilization in Sumeria. And actually, according to those texts, that was a rebirth, you might say, of the civilization in there, because there had been beings living there for hundreds of thousands of years. But they went into a period of decline and decay, or it may have been a period of destruction, and the flood, which is again a very important event in human history, which is reflected in all cultures all around the world. There is evidence of some great deluge or some great catastrophe which is described as a flood. So that event was before the development of the Sumerian civilization as it appeared out of nothing, only some few thousand years BC, few thousand years ago, but it was existing before that. So these accounts are present in, of course, scriptures also, but there are different, slightly varying descriptions of those accounts in different scriptures, but they all reflect the fact that there was definitely an ancient civilization on this planet, and it underwent some sort of catastrophe, some sort of flood, some sort of destruction, and there may also have been, there is good evidence actually, especially in the Sinai, that there was a nuclear war also, which is reflected in the stories of the Dead Sea area, where Sodom and Gomorrah were 2 cities that were destroyed, evidently by a nuclear attack. So those details come from the Sumerian texts. All right, so those are basically the sources of this information. And I'm just checking to see again if there are any more questions. If they're not, we can end the class here. We have had our first half hour, and that's kind of the minimum time I wanted these classes to be. But I'll just maybe quickly review this information, and then we will go on and talk more, beginning about the history of the recent past, and then we'll go on to the history of the ancient past of this planet, and finally we will talk about the history of our galaxy. So Abdur Razik writes, no alien has ever contacted people of subcontinents, sir. There is no such incident mentioned in our recorded history, of course, authentic one. That's not correct. There are many contacts of extraterrestrials, and in fact the older books, the Sanskrit texts, they describe this in great detail. The histories of contact by extraterrestrials with the people of this subcontinent region, the South Asia. There certainly were, and you can read those texts, they're translated into English. Of course, the other important part of ancient Sanskrit texts that proves the existence of an advanced civilization is that there were what we call flying saucers. They had developed technologies to fly not only in the air but into outer space. So there are Sanskrit texts that even describe these vimanas, they're called. There were different types of vimanas, flying machines, but some of them describe a technology which uses mercury and rotations, high electrical charges, which is the same system that the original 20th century flying saucers were based on, which the Germans developed based on those ancient Sanskrit texts. So there definitely was aliens or extraterrestrials who contacted the people of the Indian subcontinent, and the civilization of South Asia, the ancient civilization of South Asia, which we call ancient, only about 5,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, that Indus Valley civilization was also not disrelated to extraterrestrial contact. It was related to the Sumerian civilization, which had been established by advanced extraterrestrials, and it was part of that, extended part of that culture related to it. So not only are you unaware of this, obviously, that you think no aliens ever contacted people of the subcontinent, but they were the basis, really, of that civilization that we call the Indus Valley civilization. There were extraterrestrials involved in it, and they had advanced technology. And I can say just one or two more things about this that I have personally talked with. In fact, some of my Facebook friends have also reported that they have seen extraterrestrials and UFOs. So there are incidents of extraterrestrials contacting people in South Asia, even in the modern period. And certainly great details are described about the alien contacts or the extraterrestrial contacts a few thousand years ago. Nusrat Jabin again has made a comment. Aliens scare me. Sorry about this fact. So you don't need to be afraid of aliens. Aliens are people just like we are. Some of them look just like us also, and others that look differently, they are not to be scared of. Of course, there are a few alien races who are scary, who are of negative polarity, and who are trying to manipulate and control us. So it's good to be scared of them in one sense. It's good to be very cautious about them. But the majority of the aliens, as you call them, the extraterrestrials, the majority of them are not negative. They're positive, they're friendly, and they're helpful to us. And of course, many of them are sort of neutral also. They are visiting here more just like, as I've said before, students on a field trip. So there are many different extraterrestrial civilizations that have been on this planet, and most of them we do not need to be scared of at all. And those few that are frightening, we don't really need to be afraid of them. Because if nothing else, God, Allah, is protecting us, so we don't need to be afraid of anything. Especially, we don't need to be afraid of any extraterrestrials. And we have another question. Is there any area where they landed in America or Canada? Yes. In fact, it seems that more than anywhere else, it appears that in the last 100 years, extraterrestrials have been in America. And the reason for that probably is because of the material wealth of the United States over the past, in the 20th century, the great industrial might of the United States, and the development of nuclear weapons by the United States is one reason why many extraterrestrials came and landed in the United States and even met with government leaders. President Eisenhower met personally with extraterrestrials, both positively oriented and negatively oriented extraterrestrials had met with President Eisenhower. The first group was the more positive polarity ones who said, you have developed these nuclear weapons, you don't realize how dangerous they are, not only for you but for us too, and so kindly give up this development of a nuclear arsenal and we will provide you with advanced technology which will enable you to even travel into outer space and will solve your problems, your economic problems, your technological limitations. But unfortunately, the United States government did not accept that offer. President Eisenhower may have been personally more inclined to help it, but others, especially military people, wanted to continue developing the atomic weapons, and so they rejected that offer, unfortunately for us, we can say. But anyway, in the larger context, maybe it's all part of a plan. So that happened in 1952, I think was the first time perhaps. And then a negative polarity group of extraterrestrials contacted Eisenhower, and they actually drew up a treaty. And very unfortunately, the Americans were not smart enough, sharp enough to realize what they were doing. And also they were under pressure because they really couldn't do what they wanted because they knew that these extraterrestrials are more advanced, technologically more advanced. And in fact, the Germans, who, as I described earlier in this course, had first developed a secret space program, they were in league with these negative polarity extraterrestrials, and they also participated in these negotiations, which forced the hand of Eisenhower and the American government, so they kind of had to come to some sort of treaty agreement. And part of that agreement was that we, the human beings, would keep the presence of the extraterrestrials secret. They didn't want their presence to be known for a variety of reasons. So that was a very unfortunate development in one sense. It led to a lot of suffering of humanity over the subsequent 70 years or so since that happened, 60-some 70 years. We have been suffering as a result of that treaty which was made with the negative extraterrestrials and the loss of an opportunity to have a treaty with the positive extraterrestrials. So there's certainly that area was, as I recall, in Arizona and Southern California was the area where those negotiations and meetings took place. But there are many other areas, and there are, if you're not familiar with these, you can study a little bit. You can get this information on the internet very quickly. There were many landings of extraterrestrials in the United States. I myself met one in New Jersey in 1956, and at that time many people throughout the world were contacted by extraterrestrials in America and Canada and many other places. Italy was another place, Germany was another place where in the 20th century early 20th century there were contacts, and in the second half of the 20th century it seemed that by far the greatest conversation between extraterrestrials and human beings was in America. Okay, we have another comment or question here. Tariq Iqbal has written, after 5,000 years people will talk about us in the same way that we were helped and assisted by aliens. Yes, actually, because of time travel, this is again something that if you haven't yet studied about it, you should. Time travel has been developed by the American and perhaps other governments secretly, and they've not revealed it yet, but even in the 1970s and certainly in the 1980s, the American secret space programs had developed time travel. So some people say that some of these extraterrestrials who are visiting us are actually ourselves, our descendants from the future, who have come back to help us through this critical period of human history, because they know that, because they are existing in our future, and they know that some things happened that weren't so good, so they came back to change their history. So this sort of activity is possible because of time travel. It's possible to change history, but it doesn't work quite that simply. What it actually does is when somebody goes back into the past and tries to change their history, they simply create a new timeline. They don't really change their history. They just create a new timeline, and then different timelines can exist simultaneously. And that is a topic that we're going to go into tomorrow as we begin to talk about history and different historical timelines. So who knows in 5,000 years how people will talk about us. It will be very interesting as we learn more about it from those extraterrestrials or those people who are our descendants who come back to us from the future. We are going to be learning more about that in this course. All right, another comment here. Nice to see you, sir. I have to go, getting late for work. Catch your video tonight. Okay, I didn't realize it was that sort of comment. So we are very, very fortunate that this information is coming to us from a number of different extraterrestrial sources, and the two main sources that I'm using are the Law of One series and the sources from the American secret space programs. Not only American, other nations are also involved in the secret space programs, and a number of whistleblowers have come forward, especially Corey Goode, I have mentioned, Coreygoode. If you haven't yet looked him up on the internet, please do a search and prepare yourself more for this course. You can get a lot of more information that I'm not able to cover in this course from Corey Goode's disclosures and from disclosures in the Law of One series of books. And of course there are a number of others also. So let me check the time here. We can go on for a couple of more minutes. I see Nusrat Jabin has again raised a good issue. I wish they bring cure for diseases from ET world. Yes, they do have many what we would call miraculous cures, and their medical system is very, very effective, and it cures diseases. They've not been allowed, I guess you can say, to propagate that knowledge to us freely yet, but it will be coming soon, and our experience of disease, which is so widespread in the world today, will be radically changed in the near future as our contact with extraterrestrials becomes clearer and more open. So there will be cures for diseases, and actually there are cures for diseases in our world now which are being suppressed. There are many cures, for example, of cancer that are very successful, but they have been suppressed because the cabal doesn't want that there. For one thing, they're making a lot of money by pretending that they don't have a cure for cancer, and so they can get people to give money because everyone's worried about cancer. There are many different types of cures for cancer that have been offered by medical professionals who then get suppressed and persecuted. So this is just a feature of the world that we're living in at this time, where our governments, and especially our media and our educational systems, are controlled by very, very negatively oriented individuals who fortunately are losing their control, but still they have substantial control. So very soon more cures for diseases will be made available from the extraterrestrial sources. So there's one last question I'll take. Muhammad Zafar, sir, if these civilizations are good and developed enough to help us, why we are living below human level? A very good question. It's because, very simply, there are negative entities who are controlling our civilization, and they want us to remain backward so they can control us. And if we were more developed in these civilized technological developments, then they would not be able to control us. So they're preventing those technologies from being released to us. The technologies of free energy, which would stop all the pollution from the oil and petroleum industries, the coal. All of these industries are very polluting and they're totally unnecessary. The technologies are available. A number of different scientists have developed free energy or zero-point energy technologies, and they have been suppressed, persecuted, imprisoned, and even killed by the cabal and their extraterrestrial negative polarity allies. So that's the only reason why we are living such a low below human level of poverty, pollution, and it's because our governments are still heavily influenced and controlled by those negative entities. So Salma Aziz Mirza has written, Allan, Law of One talks about sex and densities. Could we talk about that? Of course, I've talked a lot about densities. I haven't talked much about sex yet. And that information is there. Frankly, that topic is very difficult for me personally to talk about. I don't really understand the Law of One teachings about sex. They do talk about how sex can be used in a positive way for spiritual development, even, you can say. So quite apart from the reproductive aspect of sex, the Law of One does discuss this, and obviously you have been reading those parts. So I will definitely continue to talk more about densities, and I'll try to get into the topics of sex, but I have to understand them myself better, and I have to feel more comfortable with those discussions before I will get into that. So please forgive me if I don't take that up right away, but I will try to in the future. But we will definitely continue talking about the history of our planet, and over the past 75,000 year cycle, when we entered this present period of humanity, and then we will talk about previous to that, because there is a very ancient history on this planet also, visits by extraterrestrial groups, and we will try to talk as much as we can also about the present period of human history, this very, very wonderful time, the Day of Judgment, as it is called, which is actually a very wonderful time, because although there is a lot of suffering going on in this time, the outcome is very glorious and very wonderful. And we all who are here now have an opportunity to participate in this glorious development, as I've called it, as we call it, the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth. So the more we learn about our true history, the more we learn about the true position of other planets and other star systems in interrelating with us, the better we will be able to participate in this very important work. So thank you all very, very much. I look forward to further discussions. Now we will move more into the history of our planet and our galaxy, inshallah. May God protect us all.